Welcome to the Learning Experience powered by Cast. I'm one of your hosts, Kelly Suding.
And I'm Luis Perez.
And I'm Brian Dean.
We are three educators here ready to break down barriers until learning has no limits. Let's do this. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of the Learning Experience. I have to say that Louise, Brian, and I are so excited to be back into our virtual studio together. Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey Kelly.
Yeah, it's going pretty well. Signs of spring around here. I'm really excited. The days are getting longer. It's also spring bird migration, so I've been out there getting as many birds. I call it Pokemon for adults. So you try to get them all. You try to get pictures, so I'm really having a lot of fun. How about you, Brian? How you doing?
I'm bada bing, bada boom, always happy to be in the room. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just excited always to be, especially when it comes to hanging out with you two. And I have to say that because you guys you're looking at me on the podcast, so I have to say it, but I also mean it. I really do.
So, I've been looking on LinkedIn lately and just kind of noticing this. This is what I've been up to. I haven't been out birding or anything like that. But have you both seen the new AI trend where you can create action figures of yourself? I mean, I've been looking through LinkedIn and it is full of professionals in plastic packages.
I have. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Have you created one yet?
I have not, but I should give it a shot and see what it comes up with. And it's probably going to be very similar to what I wear when I go out birding. It's going to put me in a safari hat, and reminds me of the Brian Fellows character from Saturday Night Live, played by Tracy Morgan. So,
oh yes, I do remember.
That's probably what it's going to come
Brian
up with.
Fellows.
Yes. So we'll see.
I love that. So for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, let me explain. So essentially, you just log into ChatGPT, you upload a photo of yourself, and then you enter a text prompt that describes your ideal action figure. And then boom, you're boxed in like the thick plastic and you're ready. You look like you're ready for store shelves. It's amazing. Yeah, it's so funny. And it's something that I never knew that I needed in my life. Absolutely never knew that. Yeah, but I tried it with some friends, so you can still see the biases in there. So you have to be very specific with your prompts, but it's hilarious. And it made me think that technology has come such a long way. I'm thinking about this AI trend, and now I'm wondering, like, if some manufacturer took those, like, they can be making tons of money by if you could submit your action figures and have those done. But thinking about how technology is today, it made me think about looking back. And so I'm just curious with you two, do you remember like what your first big piece of technology was in your own homes and what you used? Think way back.
I do remember. A Commodore 128 was my first computer. Had like 100, no, it wasn't 100. It was like probably like 60 megs of memory. Like it was something special, and I thought, man, I was a keyboard cowboy. Like I thought I could be playing war games in like 5 minutes, like I'd be hacking in, changing my grades in school and everything else. And now I think about it, my phone alone has 16 gigs of RAM for its memory. So it's insanity, right? And it's exponential. That's what it is. Like that's the amazing part is like, while we lived in an industrial revolution, we have now transformed more or transferred more into this exponential revolution, this next wave where our growth is. It's amazing. It's astounding how far we've come in, just 20 years, 30 years, 40 years.
So Brian, you and I must be around the same age because my first computer was a Commodore VIC-20. And it was a glorified keyboard, really, because I could plug it into my TV, then I could go to the library and get some programming books in BASIC. And I would spend an hour writing a program, and all it really did was make my name scroll in different ways. But it was
build
fun.
A snake. You could build a snake.
Yeah, exactly. And they say that you need, there's this myth of like the 10,000 hours that it takes to like build skill. And I've spent a good part of, good number of hours playing around with programming. Here's the other thing. I couldn't save anything.
No.
We couldn't afford the ability to save. Like they had an option where you could buy a cassette or a terminal with a cassette. You could save the cassette, people.
It's amazing,
So
brother.
anyway, we were poor, so
Yeah.
basically the keyboard, the glorified keyboard, that was the Commodore VIC 20. But anyway, it got me into computing, and it
Nice.
got me into thinking about technology is really cool. And like you said, Brian,
Yeah.
the thing we have in our pockets today, think about this: it has more power than the computers that got us to the moon,
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
like exponentially more power. So we have a lot of power and a lot of responsibility in how we use technology, which brings us
Yeah.
back to like the conversation you started us with, Kelly, with AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can do all kinds of things, but Brian and I have been thinking about like there is a cost to creating those action figures.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There,
Right.
there is a cost in terms of electricity use and water that it's required to cool those devices that create the pretty fun action figures. So
Yeah.
we want to be intentional in how we use these things. So
That's right.
just want people to keep that in the back of their minds.
Yeah. I remember the computer that we had was like this giant beige box that sounded like it was about to launch into orbit, right? Like
Hmm.
that squeak, like what was that noise, Brian? You remember it, like
Oh yeah.
ee!
Yeah,
Oh,
when
that
it,
was
like,
your
are
modem.
you
That
me
was your
for the
modem making
dial-up?
all that
Oh,
noise.
your modem dial-up? That used to be my ringtone forever. And then because I thought it was
Oh
hilarious.
yeah.
Yeah, but it came to a point where like even my kids were like, "What is that? Is that like a Transformers sound?" And I'm like, "I guess maybe it's past. Like it's not as funny anymore." But I thought it was pretty dope when it
No,
when it
right.
when it dropped.
But the big major event was when you loaded up your AOL and it finally
Hmm.
came on and it said, "You've got mail." How
Yeah,
exciting was that?
that never
Kids
happened
today
to
won't
me,
know the excitement
unfortunately.
of that.
Yeah, that
No,
never happened
no,
to
they
me.
won't.
I never had any mail.
It's so interesting because those awkward steps of just that's how tech shaped on how we thought about technology today,
Mhm.
right? About the design. And so back then also we never asked if the software or the devices worked for every learner because we just assumed back then that one size fits all, right?
Right,
Spoiler
right.
alert, it didn't. It didn't, which brings us to our topic today that we're talking about. I think we should talk about like why that mindset still shows up today in modern tech after all of these years and how UDL gives us a better blueprint. Because when accessible technology, when we have that, it's not just something nice to have, but it's really how we honor every individual with dignity, identity, and essentially agency.
Yeah, I would be clapping. I mean, I know this is an audio podcast, but I would be clapping really loudly for that because I think part of the issue is that we often just focus on the technology.
Yeah.
And I know you asked us to think back about like what got us into technology. What was the original piece of technology that we used? But that didn't happen in a vacuum, right? And so,
Right.
technology, we have to think about like how does it fit into people's lives? What is the impact that it has? And so, Brian, you might talk a little bit about human-centered design, right? And the idea that it's not just about the tools, but it's how do you use it in relation to the rest of your life, right?
Hmm.
To solve issues that you have or challenges that you have. And being intentional about that use of technology. So it's not just being used, to create action figures of yourself,
Yep.
which is fun. And I love to do that kind of thing too. But it's also being used to like have an impact on your learning in an intentional way. So, Brian, do you want to talk about
Yeah.
that a little bit?
Well, I think that it is interesting because one of the things that why inclusive practices aren't necessarily designed directly into technology today is I think because technology is about chasing features, right? Like that's the issue, right? Like having AI be able to make you into an action figure or have it write a paper or have something where you can play a virtual game with a head set on that gives you the world in a 360 surround are features. They aren't necessarily something that is inclusive because they're just this cool aspect of one side of this technological piece that does this thing, right? And because of the hype
Hmm.
cycle that it revolves around technology, we chase that and companies chase that. And then that what we don't realize going back to exponential growth, that it also like that's an exponential cycle itself. So the more I get cool features, the more I chase cool features means the more cool features are developed. And guess what? Sometimes inclusivity isn't seen to be the coolest feature, which kind of goes back to this idea of human centered design. Like anything that we design and we interact with as human beings should solve a problem for us, and it should address an issue. It shouldn't just be something that dangles in front of us, right? Like it should actually address something that exists in our lives that we can all kind of universally,
Mm-hmm.
right, work with. And I think that, to me, that's why inclusive design is so incredibly important, right? Because otherwise, we've created something vapid. We've created something that lacks real meaning, right? And it's just a cool thing in trends and falls away. And then it's not about improving technology; it's about improving the hype cycle and the feature cycle.
Yeah. I love how you said chasing the features because that's so true. And with UDL, we think about what's the goal, right? What is the goal of the technology that we're actually purchasing and using with our learners?
Well, and Kelly, I want to bring back our good friend and mentor, Joyce Abala,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about the SET framework, right? You start with the student and what their needs and preferences are, and look at the environment in which they're going to use technology. What's the task that they're trying to complete or accomplish? What's the goal, right? Like you said. And then finally, we look at the tool, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that the set framework is a really great way to stay grounded in making sure that we're considering technology and the person, the person that has to use it, that has to learn it, right? That has to use it along other technologies that they may have to use for school. So making sure that we take sort of like that ecological approach to the use of technology can sometimes kind of cause us to pause in a good way to really consider, is this a human-centered approach to technology integration, or is it just, oh, this is cool, let's integrate it
Mm-hmm.
just for the sake of including it?
So I have a question though. Like, what about those features that are put in that are really cool, but they also are accessible, but we didn't realize they were accessible. We kind of stumbled across the fact that they fit, they were more inclusive in their practice, and they were an accessibility feature. We kind of stumbled across that. Like, how does that happen? How do we stumble across those, and how do they get worked into the workflow? And then how does that become standard practice?
I think sometimes it does happen that people use technology in ways that we didn't anticipate.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably have some examples from your practice, Kelly, but just by exposing people to the technology, they find creative ways, some way of like, using it for their own means. One of the things that I use technology a lot for is in the past, and now we have AI solutions, but I often would have to do voiceovers. And
Hmm.
when I first started doing those, I didn't like my own voice, listening to it back on podcasts. But doing this podcast has gotten me over that. It's been exposure therapy. So anyway, what I would do is I would write some text, right, and have my screen reader read it, and I would record that, and that would become the voiceover. So it was not only saving me time, but it's something that started out as an assistive technology for me that now I'm using as a production tool for a
Mm-hmm.
video workflow, right? And then later on, I started doing audio descriptions using the screen reader because many of those videos I was the one speaking, so I needed a
Mm-hmm.
second voice and I couldn't hire anybody. So I think we've seen cases where like it goes both ways. Something that started out as like more under the label of assistive
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
becomes something that everybody can use. And
Sure.
then, like you said, Brian, it can go the other way. It could be a feature that wasn't even really designed for people with disabilities,
Yeah.
right? But then it becomes useful. So I'm thinking of like how I'm using ChatGPT to summarize articles. That's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily something that's designed for people with disabilities. That's just a
Mm-hmm.
productivity thing. But if
Right.
you have a cognitive disability, if you have a reading disability, that could be really powerful, creating a summary of a scientific article so that you can get the key points,
Mm-hmm.
and follow along with the conversation. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm
No,
thinking it goes both ways with universal design.
I'll direct this to you, Kelly. Like, the fact of the matter is that technology a lot of times isn't inclusively designed, right? It doesn't start out from the
Mm-hmm.
beginning that way, and it oftentimes, while it's almost pseudo human centered design, right? Like, it looks like it's really designed for to solve a human problem, but it's not really. So, but then these innovations happen, right? So how does that be like? How do you standardize that? How do you standardize building, designing inclusivity directly into technology? Like, what do we tell our ed tech partners and companies to do?
Yeah, well, let me just take it like one step ahead of that, thinking like in the classroom, is that
Yeah.
oftentimes our schools have inclusive technology, meaning there's already the accessibility features are already built into it. But then I think one thing we don't know when it's not included is sometimes all of those features, accessibility features, are not turned on. They've been blocked. So now our learners can't use it, right? And because our learners, when we think about inclusive technologies within the classroom, it's good for all. Going back to universal design for learning is good for all. And it reminded me, kind of going back to what Louise was saying about how he uses different parts of technology for different reasons, even though it wouldn't be considered assistive technology. And I remember in a classroom sharing how to use text to speech with the
Hmm.
student with a disability, and he was using it, and his peer next to him said, "Oh my gosh, this is so cool! I didn't know my Chromebook would do this." And so he
Right.
was trying it, and he had just written his paper, and then he ultimately was using it to hear what he just wrote back. And then he paused and he said, "Oh my gosh, I just heard a lot of mistakes in my writing. I didn't even know that. This is cool." So
Yeah.
it became inclusive. It was good for all. So while one learner was using that for that auditory feedback to be able to comprehend the text, his peer was using it, in fact, to find errors in that. And I know I didn't
Right.
answer that about ed tech. Louise
No.
probably can speak way deeper
Oh,
into,
you did,
yeah.
because yeah, it demystified that technology, right? So it wasn't just
Hmm.
for like this one person. It
Yeah.
was really something that the whole classroom could use to benefit. And sometimes that's what we need to do is demystify it, remove the stigma from some of these tools, because that's when people are more likely to use it. And not only that, but they're more likely to use it over time. And we know that technology abandonment is an issue, especially with assistive technology. So
Yeah.
you also need to make it like look cool, because I have been the recipient of a number of assistive technologies over the year, and they look like the Commodore VIC-20.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Going back to our conversation, so it needs to be a technology that has some aesthetics to it, right? That it fits in with like the design language of the time. Otherwise, I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to pull it out.
It's a great point.
So anyway, go ahead,
Actually,
Brian.
I love that point. I love that point because as a designer, that's one of my favorite challenges is because there is this idea that when we build something that's accessible, like we drop the aesthetic quality so that everything fits in and everything's accessible. To me, that's this beautiful design challenge, right? Like how do we kind of blend those things, right? So that the form and the function really kind of dictate like they're both incorporated into the design and that it's appealing for me to enter into, which means more people will pick it up, quite honestly. But it also does what it's supposed to do for everybody.
No, it has a greater impact, like you said, and
Right.
Hmm.
people more people are willing to adopt it. So
Yeah.
I think that's really powerful. That's inclusion, right? It's when we grow the
That's it.
circle, if you will.
That's exactly it. Like to me, that's the whole point. Is that's inclusive, right? So much like real, true, beautiful like inclusion is this blurring of lines where we just use something because we need to use it, right? And that is human centered design. That is human. And it's one of my favorite things. I think one of the best examples I've seen of that is like when you're in your car and like a text message comes up, your car can now read your text message, right? Which all it
Hmm.
is just, it's just text to speech. But it's a beautiful use of it, right? Because it's not for
Hmm.
just people who are low visioned or people, it's for people who are driving, right? So they can still hear their text message, right? And so that's one of those accessible features that became ubiquitous in what we do.
Yep.
Or closed captioning on
And
YouTube. Like kids use closed captioning on YouTube when they're riding on the train, like on the subway, or they're riding on a bus or whatever, so that they don't turn up the sound if they don't have headphones, and they can still follow along what's going on. Right? That's another one of those
Hmm.
beautiful pieces I think that happens.
Yeah, and going back, like thinking of ed tech companies creating a new software or something, co-design is a big part of that. Louise, can you talk a little bit about co-design and who should be at the table when we're thinking about designing from the start?
yeah, so I think it's important to think about like accessibility not just as product but process.
Love it.
right? Often we just think about the features, we think about the end result, but how do we get to that end result, right? And ensure that, like Brian has highlighted a number of times, that it is human centered and it is solving an actual challenge. I'll give you an example of like where it can go wrong. And how we can sort of prevent it. A few years ago, just about every day, I would get a link to a series of sign language gloves.
Yeah.
So this is a big trend from a few years back, right? The challenge with those sign language gloves is that, or signing gloves, is people were not that were designing them. They were not asking the disability community, like what do you need, right? What is really solving the challenge that you have? So it's like a solution in search of a problem. And
Wait,
so we want to make sure with co-design is like we include people at the table
Hmm.
from the earliest stages of like working with designers like Brian. So Brian's a designer, right? We want to make sure that from the earliest prototypes, the earliest even discussions before we create anything, that we are including as many people as possible.
Hmm.
And so if we're designing for a community, that community needs to be part of the conversation. Sorry, Brian, you were going to say something?
yeah, no, you both have to take me back. I have no idea what signing gloves are. This sounds really interesting. Like, did it force my hands to sign, or like, what
The
was it?
idea is that you would wear these gloves, and then that would convert the input from the gloves into text. So you would be able
Oh, I
to
gotcha.
communicate. Yeah, but there is a lot in sign language that is not just what you're doing with your hands, right?
Right.
Right.
There is some there's the way that you use your body. It's an embodied
Hmm.
experience. There's the
Hmm.
way there's some voicing too. I know
Sharing
all this because
context,
my
right?
girlfriend is a sign language interpreter.
Yeah.
So anyway, when you design something like that, then it's not to our point earlier. It's like you're designing for a community as
Yes.
opposed to with a community. That's a big
Hmm.
difference.
Hmm.
So we want to
Yeah,
get to
that's
where
it.
we're designing with people.
And that's even goes with like voices, like an individual using a communication device. Having a ton of different voices that sound like you is, is a game changer and it's inclusive. And so
Mhm.
there's more and more of that happening, and that makes me so happy that it's just not just not like one voice, right? Even our Siri, we can change voices now to sound more like us, and that's inclusive, right? That's inclusive tech, but it wasn't thought from the start. It's sort of now we're trying to embed that in there. So go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to say it's echoed throughout other parts of our culture, but this idea of like not only whose story is being told, but who's telling that story. It's not just who are we designing for, but who's designing that, right? And it's not really even. I think that we need to consider as a designer, when I fulfill that designer role, one of the things I do is I sit back, right? I know, hard to believe that I sit back and keep my mouth closed, but I do. Um, I sit back
It
and
happens every once in a while, people.
every once in a while you got to catch me on a good day. But yeah, I sit back and I just listen for a long time, right? Because that's what I want to capture. And I don't think that even when I think back to IEP process when I was teaching, I don't think that ever really happened. Like I would advocate for that. Like
Hmm.
let's hear what the student has to say, or let's hear what the learner has to say about what they need, or even maybe they can't articulate what they need, but what is the issue that's popping up? And I don't recall us doing that for any kind of like assistive tech evals or anything of like asking the student. We just kind of assumed that we knew, and it always struck me as really odd. And I think that this is just the continued progression of that, right? Like, well, wouldn't it be great if
Hmm.
you could sign and it would be like typing? Well, that's cool. That's a cool concept, but is that needed? Right? And then what does it exactly
Hmm.
need to do, and what's it not going to capture, like context or body movement or any of those other things?
Yeah, and we have a saying in the disability community, right? Nothing about us without
Hmm.
us. And I don't
There
think
you
that
go.
necessarily applies just to, I mean, obviously it's originated with the disability community, but it's
Yeah.
about users in general,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Nothing about them without them.
Right.
Right.
So we want to make sure we keep our users. And I know at CAST, when we think about co-design, one of the tools that we often use is journey mapping.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And it's been a really powerful tool for me because what journey mapping does is where you kind of break down a big task and you break it down into its smallest step as possible, and you think about where's the barrier, right? And the thing is, as designers, we often take shortcuts, right? And often
Yeah.
it's in those shortcuts that the barriers can be found.
Or a bias can be found, right? Like it's either our,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
it's not it's our design bias. And I think that that's really important. And I will say this time and time again, you're never going to get rid of your designer bias because it's part of what makes your stuff, right? Like when you look at something that I've designed, you're like, oh, it's got a Brian Dean flair to it, or it's got a Brian Dean kind of vent on it, on top of being hopefully usable and hopefully what people wanted. But I'm never going to get rid of that. It's not a question of getting rid of that. It's a question of addressing it and saying, well, do I need,
Yeah.
like, what parts of this do I need to put in check, or how much of it do I need to put in, like, do I need to put all of it in check, and what are we building, and how does it serve the goal? And I think that that's, in essence, that's kind of the idea of a barrier, right? Like whatever that barrier may be,
Right.
whether it's a social barrier, whether it's a learning barrier, whether it's a tech barrier, whatever kind of barrier it is, it's a question of how are we minimizing that. If we can't completely get rid of it, how are we minimizing it or reducing it in some fashion? And you can't do that without the voices in the
Right.
room.
Well
Yep.
said. And technology isn't inclusive until it's designed to be. And I love how you said everyone should be able to tell their story, and technology can do that when it's inclusive, because everyone should be able to tell their story in their own way.
Yeah, and have the freedom to tell it in multiple ways, right? I think that's a huge part of it.
Yes.
So, but I know that we're coming up on our time, so I'm gonna ask this question just because I don't know. There's so much out there. You guys are such experts. Like, so I'm starting out. I'm a teacher, right? I'm just in my classroom, or I'm a district, or I'm trying to build a more inclusive workspace, or whatever it is. Like, what are my quick wins? Like, how do I how do I start moving on this, make some big impact with just some easy to start with stuff?
A big thing that educators can do right away is not just about the technology, but it's about the materials that our learners are getting as well. We want to
Mm.
make sure that that technology interacts with our learners. So if our learners need to use screen readers, text to speech, that our content is given to them that's in an accessible way. So one thing I would say is just learn about how to create accessible materials. And here at CAS, we have a team that can support educators to do that. And then also the procurement of technology. Look at things at CAS. We have our site center. It's Center for Inclusive Technology and Education Systems, with tons of free resources about essentially everything that we're talking about today. So those are like low hanging fruits that we can do right away.
Yeah, I would second what you said about procurement, Kelly, because that's such a huge factor. Like, we often think as educators, we have to do all the work. And that's not really the case. We should get our ed tech companies to do more of the work as part of the
Yeah,
design process.
because we're
But some
paying
of the
them.
things that you can do, yeah, exactly. We're paying for that product and we have a contract with them. What I would say is, invite yourselves to as many conversations as you can that have to do with procurement and with adoption, and ask the question. Don't just ask the question, is it accessible? Because they're going to say yes.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
how?
How? Yeah.
How
Yeah.
and for whom? And, even ask them to do a demo. And if you want to really go guerrilla style, bring a student with a disability and
Yes.
have them test it out, because that will get through all the marketing spin. Is if that student can't log in and they can't access their information that they need, that thing is not accessible. It's not inclusive, right? So we want to make sure that it's not just like, oh, we're meeting the standards or the guidelines, right? That it's technically accessible. We want to make sure that it is also practically accessible for like
Yeah.
actual
Ah,
humans in the world doing things.
yeah, yeah. I
Yes.
love
And that
that. I
includes.
love that. I love that distinction, right? Between this is so it meets WCAG, right, or WCAG 2.1, right? Absolutely
That's
meets
right.
it. That's dope, great, fantastic. But it's still a horrible interface, right?
Yeah.
Like it's still,
Yeah.
and even for our neurodivergence, right? Like myself, like if you put a ton of patterns on your website, I'm not using it. It's overloaded. It causes too much anxiety to even just be around it. Or remember that like
Hmm.
early 2000s trend of like you'd open up a website and it automatically start playing music. Horrific. Like I
Right.
don't need that and I don't want that. I don't need to know what your top 10 song is. Doesn't matter to me, right? And as soon as I open it up and I hear that, it's like almost like an assault, right, on my senses. And I'm like, I don't want to even go near it. I have an aversion towards it. So I think
Yeah,
that
that's a
like
great
you
point.
saying, is it technical or is it practical or is it both? That's a great question to ask.
That includes all supplemental materials as well. And I
Mhm.
think we'll drop in the show notes, my friends, some procurement language, contract language that you can just copy and paste that we have on our website that you can just make that even easier for you on those low
Right.
hanging fruits.
But still look it over, right? Right? Even though it's
That's
copy and paste,
right.
don't just paste it blindly. Like be a connoisseur of what you consume online, right? In all cases, whether it be AI or, VR or XR or even language.
Yeah, but I think what we're highlighting is that, when we think about accessibility, we need to think more broadly about not
Mm.
just does it work for people that have visual impairments? Does it work for
Hmm.
people with motor challenges? But does it also work for people who are neurodiverse? So I'm glad that you brought
Mhm.
that up, Brian, because we need to consider things like cognitive load. You
Huge.
know, does it take a lot of effort to accomplish the task? Could we simplify that task in some way
Hmm.
while accomplishing the goal? I mean, a great example of like practical versus technical accessibility. I've used interfaces where, like, they're keyboard accessible, but it takes me 20 tabs to get to the
Yeah.
thing that I want. So now I'm putting forth more effort. I'm extending more of my energies, and I could see if you also have ADHD, how that could be
Hmm.
an issue, right? So let's think about accessibility more broadly in terms of like even engagement, right?
Hmm.
Um, Making sure that we are maintaining engagement is important as well. So it's access for what, right? And so David Rose, my favorite quote of his that I always remember is, "We don't want to provide access to boredom."
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
That's
That's
right.
exactly it. But
Yeah.
that doesn't mean like it's trivial either. Like it's not trivial engagement. Like there is trivial engagement where it's like, hey, here's something cool to try or whatever. But and again, usually feature chasing rather than like core chasing, like fundamental chasing. But like engagement goes deeper than that. It's the thing that lets me disengage from what I'm doing and still come back to it and find my engagement again. Like that perpetual cycle of engagement, re-engagement is really kind of the design we're looking for, right?
It's
In
when
anything,
you
in our lessons, in our technology, whatever it may be, it's that constant ability to disengage if you are overwhelmed and re-engage, right? And still
but I
find
think
you.
it's also like, Brian, when as a designer, you know this. When you design a truly engaging experience, you enter into a state of flow.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
And right now we're in a state of flow, but we also have to bring this conversation to an end
Oh,
to
We got
make
to
sure
wrap it up. I
that.
know. I
Louise
know. I
keeping
could
us
go
on
all day.
track.
But no, that's a good sign. When you're in flow, you lose track of time because you're so
That's right.
engaged, and
Hmm.
you just are you want to continue doing what you're doing, right? And to me, that's like a big piece of a good design. It's one like you really want to continue to engage with it. It's inviting, but it's also you gives you a sense of belonging there. So
That's
um,
right. And if you don't know what flow is, you should definitely hit the Google, get out there, hit the Google or your search engine of preference and look it up. The guy's name, I love originator's name. It's Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, which is a fantastic name. And if you don't find it under flow, you can find it under optimal autotelic experience.
I like flow better. That was easy.
I do too. Flow works so
Right.
much better. But I mean, I wanted to sound smart for a minute, Louise. Come on.
Brian, I think you get bonus points for being able to pronounce his last name because I've
Nice.
heard it pronounced like so
Unless you
many
just made it
ways.
up.
Yeah. Nice.
No,
He
he
could have
got
made
it.
it.
He nailed it.
All
So
Thank
right.
you. Thank you. Yeah, I just love it.
Okay, friends, this has been an amazing conversation, and I look forward to ongoing conversations. We would love to have you put comments in on this episode and let us know your ideas and thoughts about the conversation we've had today, and keep it accessible.
That's right. Peace, love, and belly rubs.
can't say anything better than that.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Learning Experience Podcast. We are so glad you're a part of this conversation.
And if you like me in today's episode, sparked some ideas or got your brain flowing, well, just remember there's so much more to explore out there.
And remember that CAST is leading the way when it comes to accessibility, workforce innovation, professional development, and research.
So visit cast.org to dive deeper. That's CAST.org, and keep learning with us.